Welcome. My name is Steve Winnick, and I'm here at the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress, and we're talking with Reggie Harris. Reggie is a great singer and songwriter, and he was part of our Homegrown at Home concert series this past year, 2020. It's now 2021. Things have changed a little bit, and we're going to be talking to Reggie about his history, his music, and a little bit about what's going on in the world right now. So I guess we're going to start out, Reggie, just by asking you how you're doing in this pandemic time.
Well, it's great to see you, Steve. And
Yeah,
how
good to see
am
you
I
too. Yeah.
doing? I'm doing well, actually. But as you know, it's kind of a hour by hour, day by day process. I do so many things in performance and in writing, and so all of those different genres that I'm kind of running through add their own sense of checking in with what's going on in the world.
Hmm.
I'm glad to say that I'm physically well, and I've been taking all my precautions and wearing my mask and staying home when as much as I can. But I did make a couple of trips to Pennsylvania. I'm working on a CD and went to a recording studio there in Michigan. And it's interesting to be out in the world. I actually had a streaming gig from Cafe Lena in Saratoga Springs, which is two
Very
hours
nice.
north of me. It was really nice and it was really weird playing for an opening, playing for an empty room, driving to the gig. I hadn't driven to a gig in almost a year.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm
So that was
processing everything.
so that was a gig where you were in the room, but the audience was not, and it was streaming from Cafe Lena.
It's a wonderful venue, and I've played there
Yeah.
a number of times. I had a sound person. I had, a sponsor who was kind of, administrating things, and an empty room. It was an unusual experience to say the least. But it was really funny. Since I've been streaming and zooming and all the online platforms so often, um, I've gotten used to the fact that when you finish a song, there's nothing.
Yeah.
So I just talk. I talk to people like we're talking now. And later on, I got emails through my website and through my email, and people said, "Oh, you were wonderful." And I thought, okay.
Phew. Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's funny. I mean, it's amazing because one of the things that we're thinking about from a programming standpoint, and I'm sure that folks who are musicians and other performers have to be thinking about it too, is to what extent this will continue even after it doesn't absolutely have to continue.
Right.
Do you know what I mean? In the
Yeah.
sense that you could play a concert in South Africa this way without having to go there physically, and that's something that the world might need. Have you thought about that at all?
Actually, it's really funny. I 2 days ago, I just heard from a sponsor who I've worked with in Austria and Germany, and he wrote and he said, I've watched several of your concerts, and I'd like you to do one for us." And I said, "Oh, great." We said, "Okay, let's pick a date." And I remember what it took to get to Germany and Austria.
Yeah,
So yeah, I think as we come out of this, once the numbers go down and we reduce the curve and flatten the curve, and
yeah,
the world is gonna be. I have now, yes, people who know my work who didn't before in a variety of countries. And also even just here, I do online programs. When I was on with the Library of Congress, people were writing me from California and from Alaska,
right.
and people can be anywhere and tag in. So yeah, it's this will be a very interesting thing to come out of and to see where it lands.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, we're going to go back and talk to you about your earlier history, but before we do that, we just were alluding to the fact that the world has changed a little bit, and we're speaking now on the day after the inauguration of Joseph R. Biden. And I wonder what your reaction was to all of the events of yesterday.
I was in awe. I woke up yesterday, and of course, we all knew it was going to happen. But with all of the events of the last few weeks, there was a sense of anxiety, and there was just a sense of not knowing. I think it's remarkable how things happen in history and in our lives that what was it? You know, President Biden came very close to dropping out of the race, to not being a
Right.
factor. And then a shift in South Carolina, and then a growing attitude of change that recognized him as a calming influence, someone that could talk about healing our nation. And that's so much of what I've been talking about, not so much healing, but approaching a window through which we can begin to heal. And then to have him choose Kamala Harris as his vice president and have this remarkable shift into the future as we sort of thought of it. We've never had a woman as a vice president. We certainly have never had one as a president. And to see him take that bold step, to see all of the people who worked, men and women, but particularly women, the WNBA, the women in Georgia, to see how they're embracing this charge years ago had finally come to fruition. So yeah, there's been so much change. At
Yeah.
the same time, I feel a real connection. And I saw a really great article a couple of weeks ago. They were talking about the women in Georgia who helped to really change the voting rights in that state. And they were giving homage to those women and the men who in the 30s and 40s and 50s were doing the work that set the table. And certainly, as you know, I get so much of a charge, and so much of what I ground myself in is the music of the Underground Railroad, the spirituals,
Hmm.
and roots music that helped people in earlier times when things were just as, if not more, divided. Help them persevere, help them find their person, their selves, help them keep their feet on the ground. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, oh, freedom over me. All those songs that I sing, wade in the water. I've been really focusing on those songs, particularly in this pandemic, because I know that when I was growing up, the old folks, as we used to call them,
Yeah.
and now, of course, I look in the mirror, but the old folks used to sing those songs to us and with
Mhm.
us. And I often say, I don't know where I heard this first, but those songs seep into your bones.
Sure.
And so in all of this turmoil, I find myself at a very calm center much of the time, not all the time, but much of the time, because I know that those folks went through things that my experience pales in comparison. And so I take a lot of joy and support from those elders who came before.
Hmm. Great. And in addition to elders, we had a great youth participant, our former national youth poet laureate, gave a reading. How did that affect you?
I was spellbound. Well, first of all, that yellow coat. I mean, really,
Yes.
you know. But I was so astounded by her poise in the moment. Now I have no idea what she was feeling, inside, and as a performer, I know what those moments can feel like.
Yeah.
But she was so composed. Her words carried weight. You know, she she focused herself in that space and in that spirit. And I heard her also give tribute, both in what she said and also what she wrote, to those who had come before her, to those whose legacy she was stepping into, at the same time opening this whole window to a new vision, a new voice, a new frame. I just thought it was a great moment of transformation, and I thought that the inaugural team really did a wonderful job with honoring a lot of different sides, which actually is, of course, what they're calling us to. That all voices in America need to be heard from. But she was astonishing.
Great. Yeah. Amazing. Well, she's another in a long line of strong Black women,
Yeah,
and that's been a theme in your life as well. So
yeah,
let's go back to your beginnings. I know you were raised by a couple of strong Black women yourself.
yeah. I really was. Helen Harris and Helen Roberson. My grandmother, Helen Roberson, was one of those who migrated from the fields of Virginia, and she and her husband came north to Philadelphia, and settled in and began to try to make their lives more than they could have been in Virginia. 6 million African Americans fleeing the South,
Yeah.
only to find, of course, that when they got to the North, things were not the promised land.
Yeah.
But they did have opportunities. And then my mother, raising my sister and I, we moved in with my grandmother in my early years after my parents divorced. And those women, those women and the women in my church and the women teachers that I had, there was such a powerful fabric of community that they tuned me into. And I was able to thank my mother. She died in 2003. But in that last 2 years, we had this remarkable time where I was able to see in a different way, from her perspective, what it was that she was dealing with. She was
Hmm.
a factory worker, who made clothing for boys at a factory in Philadelphia. And I realized in my first job, when I went to work for Head Start years later, that I was out earning my mother automatically.
Yeah.
But she and my grandmother were the rocks in my house. And then there were women and men in the community who they just gave us lessons, sometimes by what they said, sometimes by what they lived, and sometimes by what they sang.
Hmm. So, you were growing up during what we now think of as the sort of height of the civil rights movement.
Mhm.
How did that affect your community and yourself personally?
Well, it's really funny because there were different segments, of course, of the community. I was aware of some of the civil rights stuff that was going on, but I grew up in a house that wasn't particularly politically active.
Hmm.
I went to a church that was evangelical in nature, a Black Baptist church. Now, there was a Black Baptist church 15 blocks away where Reverend Leon O'Sullivan was pastor. And Leon Sullivan was leading boycotts and he was leading protests and he was working with Dr. King, but he was also establishing some frameworks in Philadelphia. So I was aware of that stuff that was going on, but we were kind of more in a spiritual, religious setting, thinking about heaven actually, and thinking
Hmm.
about the life beyond. But all that stuff was around me, and actually, I found out when I was about 26 years old that the house that we lived in uh, was a house that was bought by my grandmother and grandfather with help from my mom and her sister, who just died actually in December of COVID,
Mm. Sorry
at
to hear that.
98 years old.
Wow.
Well, Aunt SUUSI and my mom, Helen, helped my grandmother and grandfather buy a house. And they did that because of another strong Black woman who was in my life, a woman named Juanita Kidd Stout. And
Hmm.
Juanita Kidd Stout used to come by our house every now and then. I didn't know who she was. My sister and I would always say, "Who is that woman?" And my grandmother and mother were always so glad to see her. I didn't know that Juanita Kidd Stout and a white realtor in the area made it possible for them to buy that home that they coveted. And it was done secretly because it was an all white area. So we were the first Black family on the block. By the time I was growing up, all of the white people had moved away, with the exception to one Italian family in the middle of the block, and one Jewish family that ran a grocery store across the street. But when Anita Kid Stout would come by and she would say, "Are you young people studying hard in school? Are you going to grow up to be something? What are you going to be?" And we always thought, who is this woman? Why is she pressuring us?
Right.
Well, as it turned out, she went from being a lawyer to being a DA in Philadelphia and then eventually to the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania.
All right.
So these were the kinds of people that were in my life. And they weren't trumpeting who they were. They were just living lives and challenging us to be more than we could see in those days.
Right. Yeah. So, so you've written about the time when you went to school and how you had a few sort of awakenings there as far as the issues of segregation and just race relations went. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, well, in sixth grade, my mother went to a parent teacher meeting, and someone at that meeting, I guess the meeting was called to talk about integration. And she came home and she said that they gave me a choice. I could go up the street 2 blocks to the school in my neighborhood, or I could go across town. And whoever was talking to them emphasized that the school across town was a better school.
Yeah.
White kids went there.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my mother came home and she said, "So we're going to send you to a better school." So that meant I had to get on a trolley and then a subway for a couple of blocks. And I landed in this schoolyard with all these kids who didn't look like me. It was about 80% white. And we landed in the schoolyard, and suddenly there was chaos. Now, I remember that the school faculty was integrated, and Philadelphia never used the I word.
Yeah, right.
But there we were, all together and mixed up, and there were fights, and there were, arguments, and there were, we were trying to make whatever we could of it. Sooner or later, we began to figure out that these were just kids, and we were playing games and studying together. But then in 8th grade, my mother came to another parent-teacher meeting, and she met my 8th grade homeroom and history teacher, a very light-skinned black man named Mr. Nicholas. He's lodged in my memory because he again said to my mother, he said, "Where's Reginald going to go to high school?" And she said, "Well, probably come back into my neighborhood and go there." And he said, "Well, Reginald's a really eclectic kid," which my mother thought meant I talked too much. And he said, and I think that he would do better if he went to the school where most of these kids are going to go. And he said, "It's a little farther away, but I think he would benefit." So she said to him, "Is it a better school?" And he said, "Yes, Ms. Harris, it is." So that's where I ended up. Now, I ended up in a school, as I said, 5 neighborhoods or so away. It was also mostly white, but it was one of the best schools in Philadelphia, Olney High School.
Oh, yeah.
And it was in that school that I got introduced to a wide array, both musically and just physically, because I became part of the choir. We traveled all over Philadelphia. We sang in synagogues and churches and flower shows. And the music that we did crossed all barriers. We did, some she shanties. We did, classical pieces. We did spirituals, the arranged spirituals. We did. My teacher, Mr. Nietzsche, my choir director, was just a remarkable man who, in a very integrated, very large choir, seemed to see all of us. And I knew from several experiences that he really saw me. And that was a very powerful experience to be in that school. I will tell you that I was out of my neighborhood and out of, class identification. There was a lot of racial stuff going on in Philadelphia at that time. We had a race riot in 1968.
Right.
And I got caught in the race riot between, black and white students who I had already made friends with. But several people told me when the riot happened to get out of the school because he said people on both sides were looking for me.
Wow.
And it was the first that I began to think about myself as a bridge builder, because when I was making those friendships, I wasn't thinking about race. I wasn't thinking about what religion kids were. I grew up in an environment where, you were supposed to treat people with respect.
Yeah.
And I tried to do that as best I could. And I think that navigating those neighborhoods, I used to walk to the bus and people would let me know that they didn't really like me in their neighborhood.
Yeah.
But it also connected me to some of the people who would eventually connect me to the guitar, to folk music, that, I suddenly saw a different way to move through life. And then it eventually led me to play the guitar and to become a performer. So,
well, when you said that that you heard that students on both sides of the race riot were looking for you, did you take that to mean that other African American kids were mad at you for being friends with white people?
Absolutely. There was a whole faction of kids that, they would say to me that you're not black enough.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And they would challenge me. When the riot came off, actually, I was one of the, I think, few black kids who hadn't heard that there was going to be a sit-in, because I was in the wrong circles. So at one moment, I was on my way to class, and the easiest way to get to the class I was going to was to cut through this marble staircase on the second floor. And I opened the door to go in, and it was filled with black students from the school. And there was a girl in my homeroom that was in front of the door, and when she saw me, she said, "Oh, well, it's about time you joined us." And I said, "Joined what?" And she looked at me and she grabbed the door and slammed it in my face.
Oh no.
And yeah, so there was a lot of pressure. I was listening to the wrong kind of music. I didn't dress, black enough. And clearly, clearly there were also white kids who just thought that I was trying to be something that I wasn't. So yeah, I understood the meaning. And I took myself home for a few days until the all clear was sounded by the school board. Um, but when I came back, things shifted a bit. And, they were shifting all over the country, which I didn't know at that time.
Right.
There was, there were race riots in '68, all kinds of places, Detroit, Philadelphia, Boston, Oakland. It was the beginning of me beginning to understand the racial and political dynamic in America. And I kind of traced my awakening to that year.
Hmm. Now you mentioned that it also one of the positive effects of it was that it connected you to people who later connected you to the guitar. Talk about that, about the sort of musical impacts there.
Well, my musical palette had been expanded. The church I grew up in, we did some of the choirs. We had about 5 choirs, and they did different things. So I was used to hearing gospel. I was used to hearing the spirituals. But the senior choir in our, they used to do arranged spirituals and some classical pieces. And then of course I was hearing music on the radio and as I could. So I had all of this. And then in high school, meeting these kids with different, musical tastes, I was beginning to discover this wide array of music that was out there. And after high school, I began to, of course, make other friends as I began to get jobs. And there was a young woman who I met who came to work at the Head Start. Actually, it wasn't Head Start. It was a Center for Emotionally Disturbed Kids.
Hmm.
She came to teach there, and we started dating. And that's the first time I got taken to a folk concert.
Hmm.
And we went out to, hear a concert at the Main Point in Philadelphia.
Hmm.
And I didn't know about this amazing place. It was a long way from my house. But the performers I began to hear. And then, of course, I thought back to second grade because we sang so much in my school, in elementary school, and we sang all sorts of songs. But I remember that in second grade, my teacher, Miss Churn, had introduced us to Woody Guthrie and Pete Seeger,
Hmm.
and then some of the work songs, and that sort of lodged inside of me. So once I started to get this, new view of folk music, a lot of those songs began to make sense. And at the same time, I was really beginning to look around and see how song was really interacting with life, how people were expressing themselves. Also, now I was beginning to listen to more pop music. And
Hmm.
so all of those sort of rose up in me in a different way. And so I was dating this young woman, and she turned to me at one point in our dating life, and she said, you are so musical. We're going to these concerts. I'm surprised you don't play an instrument. And I said, really? I said, well, I'm doing a lot of things. And she said, well, I think you should take guitar lessons. And I said, well, I wouldn't know where to start. She said, well, actually, I'm taking guitar lessons. And why don't you, I can teach you a few chords. And I said, well, actually, I'm kind of busy. And then she said, I thought you were a curious, interesting person, but if you're not willing to learn at least a couple of chords, I don't think I want to date you. So I said, teach me a chord. And she taught me a D. And then she taught me a G, and I was hooked. So I actually had a chance to see her again. We broke up eventually, and
Yeah,
she
yeah.
went on to life. But she became a librarian in a school, and lo and behold, years later, I played that school, and I was able to say to her, "Thank you so much for for being so persistent."
Yeah, well, that's life changing, huh?
You never know.
Yeah. So that's how you started on the guitar. How did you kind of get more serious about it?
Well, I tell you, it unlocked something in me that was uncontrollable. Every spare minute, every spare hour I had that guitar in my hand. I first began by listening to records and trying to figure out what they were doing. And then I got a couple of teachers, and they began to help me to make sense of the instrument. But I found out I have a very natural aptitude for, I knew that singing harmonies and singing anything wasn't really ever that hard for me. When I used to sit in the choir, as the choir director was going over all the parts, by the time we got finished, I knew all the parts. And so
Nice.
to amuse myself during any rehearsal, I was part of the tenor section, but most of the time I was either singing alto, I'd sing the bass, I'd sing some soprano, and that gave me this amazing ability to arrange things in my head so that I could represent all the parts. And it certainly helps me now, as I find myself in the studio singing different parts or helping other singers to sing. But with the guitar, I just remember that I had one teacher who was a really great instrumentalist, and he didn't sing at all. But once I started to play the guitar, I started wanting to write.
Hmm.
And so I started writing these little songs. And so I would come in for my lesson every week, and he would teach me, some aspect of, scale or whatever. And then he would say to me, "So, did you write anything this week?" And I would say, "Yeah." And he would say, "Oh, well, why don't you play it?" And it was the funniest thing because I I hear things differently. So I would play what I had written with, a chord structure, and he would say, "How did you get there?" And I said, "Where?" And it's funny, it reminded me that in 12th grade, second chair, I was first chair tenor. Second chair came in one day, and he was late. He was always late. And he opened up his a book, and there was all this music paper in there. And I said, "What's that?" He says, "Oh, I didn't do my homework for theory and composition." And I said, "What's that?" And he said, "I'm taking theory." I said, "What's theory?" Well, this guy, my guitar teacher, used to say, "Did you take theory?" I said, "No." He says, "Well, how did you get from here to there?" I said, "That's what I heard." And he said, "It doesn't make any sense to go from there to there." And I said, "Well, that's what I heard." And that really has been kind of my life.
Hmm.
It's sometimes I really do wish that I had gone to music school, that I understood the way music construction works in a more facile way. But I've had a lot of musicians tell me that I probably wouldn't write what I write if I did.
Well, that's the thing. If you're happy with what you've written and your teacher told you you wouldn't have gotten from there to there with the theory, it seems like the theory could have held you back to some extent in there. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the diversity of the world.
right,
And then I began to, hear about all these musicians who, didn't read music and never went to music school and all that. And you just understand that in our lives, we have a lot of different ways to get where we're going.
right. There's both things, and
There are.
people get there in both ways, and there's incredible people even in this series that we've done this year. There's people with great background in theory, and people with no background in theory doing great things. So it's just the way it works.
Well,
Yeah.
it's really fun. I mean, I've just been in the studio for about 6 months working on a CD. And sometimes the conversations we have are just great, and my engineer and my co-producer will get into a conversation just about, ninths and, whatever.
Right.
And I just kind of go, well, talk about it, or if I need to know what something is, I
Yeah,
ask.
sure. So let's talk about the Kim and Reggie Harris duo, which you were part of for quite a long time in your career.
Hmm.
How did that
40
get
years.
started? Yeah.
Well, this same young woman who started me on the guitar encouraged me to go back to college because I had dropped out after a couple of years. And so to do that, I quit my job, and I needed a summer job. So she actually turned me on to this camp just north of Philadelphia, Horsham, PA, College Settlement Camp. And I went for an interview, and I got a counselor's job for that summer. And lo and behold, she and I broke up right after the summer. But I went to camp, and there I met this girl who just graduated from high school, Kim Richards, and she was also learning the guitar. She'd been playing for a while actually,
Hmm.
and we discovered that we both liked Cat Stevens and Pete Seeger and all these different musicians. And again, she had gone through a lot of the same things in school that I'd gone through. People telling her that she wasn't black enough, and that she wasn't culturally appropriate. And so we started talking at a party and discovered that we had all this, these things in common. And then we discovered that our voices blended. And
Great.
so every night during that summer, she would come down to my cabin, and we would sing my kids to sleep. And in the fall, I found out that she was going to Temple University, where I was going back to school. So we would meet on campus, and we began to meet, between classes. And suddenly we were learning songs together. Both of us began to write songs. And then we started looking around for places to perform. And we started going out and singing at open stages and singing at churches and places. And soon we were performing 6 nights a week.
Wow.
And so it became clear that we loved doing it. As to whether or not we could make a living doing it, we had no idea. But one thing led to another. And before we knew it, we got a gig actually at a place, a comedy club that opened in Philadelphia. And we became a rotational music relief
Okay.
for it. So as places, I worked actually at this place for about 2 years. We sang on Thursday through Sunday.
Hmm.
And people like Jay Leno and Michael Keaton and all of these comics who became famous would come through. And in the middle of the show, they would put a musical act to sort of cleanse the palate. And that's where we started getting some of our early experience. And then suddenly we got an opportunity to go on the road and play at colleges. And then we had an opportunity to go into schools.
Hmm.
It was a 40-year journey of, I remember in the latter years of, our being together, here we were standing on a stage in Austria with 1,000 Austrians leading them in the song Rainbow Race by Pete Seeger.
Hmm.
And I thought, wow, I had no concept when I was growing up that this could ever happen. But we discovered the Underground Railroad together and began doing programs with that. How music was used as secret codes and community building during the time of slavery. Suddenly, we were doing music of civil rights, and then both of us were writing and recording albums and doing TV shows. The journey was again one step at a time, and doors open, windows open, doors closed. It was a really fertile partnership.
Hmm. So you mentioned the Underground Railroad as one of the things that caught your attention early on, and one of your early albums was about that, and then you revisited it later. How has that been a sort of ongoing thread for you throughout your career?
Well, it has in many ways been the bedrock of my career. Kim and I discovered that at a time when work was getting hard to get to find. Around 1982, musical tastes were changing, and the places that we could play weren't as enamored of what we were doing, and there were all kinds of other things going on. And we got this small opportunity from the Philadelphia Folk Song Society. They were sending performers into schools for a week, and they would subsidize the performers, and then you would play the school, and they just wanted you to go in and do something that showed how folk music had impacted people in history.
Hmm.
And Kim remembered this program that came to her school when she was in 5th grade about the Underground Railroad. And it wasn't even a full show about the Underground Railroad. It was just a little snippet. But that's why I always remember that whatever you say in a school, or for that matter, anywhere, can open a door for someone or plant a seed that grows years later.
So
Because
true.
she
Yeah.
remembered that, yeah. And so we just kind of researched a little bit and made up a little half-hour or 35-minute program. Went into 5 schools, and they paid us for the week. As musicians, you're always trying to get to the dollar.
That's right.
Um, but our interest was piqued.
Hmm.
This was a part of history that I didn't know about growing up, and it was a part of African American history and all of American history. And I found it fascinating, the story of the Underground Railroad, because in addition to the musical aspect of it, this was a movement that crossed barriers. It crossed boundaries. People from different races, different colors, religions, from no religion, from different social classes. I love that story. And of course, by now, I'm seeing that our performances really are, again, bridge building.
Hmm.
And I thought this would be a really great thing to hold up to people, that at a time when the nation was divided, that people came together to take on this evil thing. And they did it, and they really changed the world. And the courage that it took. And then, of course, you have Harriet Tubman, you have Frederick Douglass, and you have all these remarkable African Americans, Benjamin Banneker. Well, that led us into talking about African Americans and which was our second show, was called Dream Alive, a celebration of Black history.
Hmm.
So the through line for the Underground Railroad, I just finished 2 weeks ago, videos that are now going into schools. Since I can't perform there live, I'm sending out videos, 45-minute videos aimed at K through 5 and then 6 through 8, about the Underground Railroad. and just introducing the audiences that I would be standing in front of
Right.
to this amazing story.
Right. Well, I'm struck by there's a little bit of irony here, but it goes to what you said about being a bridge builder. That you and Kim both had that experience of being the kids who weren't black enough, and yet you're the ones who are, teaching people about the Underground Railroad now. It's kind of an interesting reversal there, given your life story. What have you thought about that much?
A lot. Well, it in that direction, I think in many ways, and we had talked about this many times over the years, in some ways, because we were caught between the worlds, it made us uniquely qualified to represent that middle space.
Hmm.
And I've just found it a very powerful thing to live into. I later, of course, found out that my family is one that bridged a divide. And when I found out in 1992 from one of my cousins in Virginia that our family started on the plantation in Virginia, Hickory Hill, and it started because the master, Williams Carter Wickham, had 6 children by my great 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 grandmother, Viviana.
Hmm.
So I have the Wickham family, which I am part of, and I have the Hewlett family, black and white. And there I am again in the middle.
Yeah.
So, in one sense, I have accepted this mission. It was not easy early on. There was a lot of things to deal with in terms of not being a part of either community, or at least not being accepted fully by either community. But that's one of the things I think that music has been so powerful in helping me with. Music and some therapy too.
Yeah.
I've done some, counseling on it. I've done also training. I've taken training on race relations and prejudice reduction, which really was necessary because I just found myself in situations where people were asking me to represent and to comment on and to be part of this panel or part of that panel, or thrust in the middle of warring factions at a school or university. And I thought to myself, I don't have skills to do this. So it became important to seek out some skills, to read some
Hmm.
books, to talk to some people who do this. But I find music is probably, at least as a starter and an opening, the best way to approach that. Uh, Along the way, my writing as a songwriter really changed to embrace that as well. And I think that is also one of the places that I've continued to deal with and process my own journey is
Hmm.
in the songs that I write.
Hmm. Well, say a little more about that. What are your go-to themes for writing, your songs these days?
Well, I just wrote a song actually that I'm on the new CD. It's called "It's Who We Are."
Hmm.
And often I would get questions: "How far have we come in race relations?" And a lot of time that was from kids, after a program, and they would say, "Well, how was it when you were growing up, and how far have we come?" Or people, you hear this question on people say constantly. As a matter of fact, President Biden said this just a couple of weeks ago. So this is not who we are. And if we look at our history, and if we look at all of those places from before America, the time America was America, this is who we are.
Yeah, regrettably, it is who we are in many ways. Yeah.
So I started writing a song that said that 2 years ago. But one of the things that I do in my writing, and I try to do always, is I try to point out things as many of my mentors, and particularly James Baldwin, who I saw speak at a conference some years ago. He said the role of the artist is to see what's happening in your society and to put that into your filter and then to show people what it is you see. And when he said that, I was a big crowd and we were there and listening. And I thought, oh, that's right. We artists are so important. And then he said, sometimes you will have to show people that are hard, things that they don't want to see, things that need to be fixed. They will not love you for showing them those things. And I thought, oh, but I've embraced that mission over the course of years. But I always try, and I think this is who I am,
Hmm.
in pointing out what I see as being hurtful, devastating, or in need of healing, to always provide some aspect of hope because that's who I am. So I couldn't write the song. It was very difficult to find the framework where the song would shift. And then the phrase came, but we can change.
Mhm.
So I think that is, and there's so many of my songs that follow that theme, the opportunity for being the change. There's a great wall at the National Civil Rights Museum in Memphis that says, be the change. And that saying goes all around the place. I believe that to my heart, that everything we do in the positive leads to some possibility that we'll get to where we really want to go. And I think that's what I also saw in yesterday. It was the opening of that window again for people to say, yeah, we have a lot of problems. And in this moment, we are going to celebrate the fact that we can look forward. We're going to celebrate all of this diversity. We're going to celebrate the possibility, and then we're going to get to work. So there's another song on the CD called "Standing in the Name of Freedom," standing in freedom's name, and I wrote that song because in 2015 I got a chance to meet C.T. Vivian.
Yeah.
We had him at a conference, and he was about 90, 91 at the time. And I have never seen anybody who had a more beatific presence for somebody who had gone through what he went through and has gone through in his life. And that moment when he stood on the steps in Selma, Alabama, facing Sheriff Jim Clark and put his finger in Jim Clark's face and said, "We are willing to be beaten for justice, for democracy." That moment settled in me, and I wrote the song "Standing in Freedom's Name," because the image of him standing there in a moment when Jim Clark could have easily pulled out his gun, shot him dead, and had no repercussions at all.
Right.
But that courage to stand up, John Lewis, Fannie Lou Hamer, all of these people, I just embraced the power of their joy at working for freedom and justice. And a lot of that joy comes from the music. So I just want to produce more music that centers people in courage and joy.
That's great. And you mentioned that a lot of that joy comes from music, and that's always been the case. So along this civil rights path and before that in the Underground Railroad period, that path, there were songs all the way, and you've talked about the roots music as a big influence on your writing. So let's talk about those spirituals a little bit and the other songs that are part of that stream and how they've influenced you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I grew up, as I said, in a church where songs like "Wade in the Water" and "This Joy That I Have," the world didn't give it to me. The world didn't give it, so the world can't take it away. I think back to those times, and those people were singing those songs from some place. You and I have discovered, talked about the song "Sheep, Sheep, Don't You Know the Road?"
Yeah. Great.
And "Free at Last," which
Free
you
at
were,
Last, of course.
yeah. Those songs, and I listened to those voices on recordings, and those people knew that energy rose out of them from a different place. I find myself trying to, in my more contemporary styled voice, find that fabric, and I'm, it's funny, as time goes on, I get closer to it, but I think, authentically, the weight of their lives was different than mine.
Yeah.
And so I don't focus on that too much. I sing from my own place. But so it was hearing those songs that energized me. And then, of course, hearing the collision of other songs as they came, hearing Richie Havens, doing Freedom, which, comes straight out of the spirituals.
Yeah.
Hearing the blues and the ways in which people, the simplistic nature of a personal expression. So I'm just informed so much by the spirituals, the blues, and then, of course, I have all of this history with Bach and with Mozart and these amazing counterpoints. And, so I have a lot of resource to work from. And on the new CD, I always try to cover, a spiritual or two on any recording that I do. On my Ready to Go CD, I covered "Sheep, Sheep, Don't You Know the Road." In this one, I pick up a little. There's a really great song that was written by a young man named Joshua Campbell as a tribute to John Lewis, called "Rise Up, March On." And so I'm covering that one on the new CD. But in the middle of it, I had to drop in "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around."
Hmm.
So these musical mashups, because I find that one of the roles I'm playing these days, as I hear new music rising and a new generation formulating their own style, I love introducing some of the old songs into the fabric so that they can understand that the music that they're producing is still coming from somewhere.
Hmm.
And so that's one of the great joys that I have, and particularly when I'm introducing these, whether it's in video or if I'm live in concert. Um, it's really funny. Sometimes if I'm performing, I was performing just before the pandemic in Iowa and Illinois, and I was at a school in Iowa. And the students came in and they saw me on stage with my guitar, and they kind of, oh God, he's so 5 minutes ago. And but I just slowly started into this rhythmic rendition of Wade in the Water because I know what that song does. And slowly but surely, I could see them kind of, the smiles and the laughs and the jeers went away. And then all of a sudden, I saw them start rocking. But then I can talk about the fact that that song rose out of the desire for people to make it to freedom. And the song was also very practically one that told people that when you were making your journey to freedom, you needed to walk through the water so that the dogs couldn't pick up your scent. You needed to stay close to the water so that you could get food, fish in the water. You needed to stay hydrated as you moved. The song helped you to keep yourself going when the weariness came in. The fact that, rivers separated people from slave and free states. All of that is contextualized in that song. And that song is part of the reason why we are all here. Well, by the third minute. And I watched this happen all over the country. And it is one of my greatest joys that we can tie one generation to the next and have that through line fabric be part of the life that we're living. And then to see young people picking that up in the way that they write, or remind older people of something that they've let go of in their lives. Because that's the other thing in this pandemic. A lot of the concerts that I've been doing, people write to me, and this is the same message that I've heard as I've been traveling for the last 4 or 5 years. People come to my shows and they say, I went home from work and I was really tired. And I saw the announcement of your concert and I really wasn't going to come. But I thought, let me just check out his website. And they checked out the website and they heard a couple of these songs. And I remember one woman said, I came because you looked hopeful.
Hmm.
And I said, well, I am. And she says, how are you so hopeful in this time? And I get to talk about why I'm hopeful. The same thing has been true of my online concerts. People write in the chat, or they write to me by email and say, you're singing songs that infuse me with hope. Well, that's why those songs came into being.
Yeah. Well, it's funny because you're mentioning when President Biden said this is not who we are, and your recognition that it is in many ways who we are. So that can be looked at either sort of negatively, right? So this is who we are, and that's a bad thing.
Mm-hmm.
But the fact that the president is saying that it's not, that is to say, rejecting that as the possibility of who we are, gives us hope, right? Because it's not, because now we're not aspiring to be that, at least, and we know where we need to go in some sense. Do you see what I'm saying? And I
I
think
see
that,
exactly what you're saying, and I
yeah,
agree with you 100%. And I think one of the hard things, and I understand what he's trying to do, and I understand that, as a politician, and I think he's a really amazingly wonderful man. I mean, his life speaks volumes to understanding that people have pain and that situations are hard. And I think, he's trying to create a rallying cry, which we certainly need.
yeah,
And to call people to, as President Abraham Lincoln would say, better angels. And I wrote a song about that too. Um, and we need to be called to a greater sense of ourselves, but we also need to acknowledge who we are. And I think where I really get that, I mean, I get that from a lot of sources. But, one of the things that's true about the spirituals is that I think the power of the spirituals really is centered in the fact that there are spirituals that just give you the opportunity to say, I am here and I hate it.
Yeah.
Oh Lord, how come me here? I wish I'd never been born. You get to acknowledge that your life is not working, that pain is present, that you have no way of seeing. Those people had no idea of what was going to come, that they would be free. Most of them did not get free.
Yeah.
We have 4 million people in slavery. And when we think about the Underground Railroad, it really only helped about 150 to 170,000 people. We'll never even know how many exactly. But they sang those songs. You get that stuff out of your heart and soul and body. But they don't stay there. The spirituals also then give you a practical way of looking at a path forward. And then all the way to Free at Last, which of course
Yeah.
just says, well, no, we're not free yet, but we're going to celebrate the freedom we have.
Yeah.
We celebrate it here in our hearts and our minds. And one day, as Martin Luther King said, one day we will all say free at last together. Now, are we at that day yet? No. But, you have to look forward and you have to look back, and then you have to look where you are. And the songs give you an opportunity to do all of that. And so, as I'm planning concerts, for example, I want to do that with the songs that I'm singing. I want to, so much. I was having a really great conversation with Bernice Johnson Reagan some years ago. And we were mourning the fact that spirituals were no longer being sung in the Black church, and that people felt like they'd moved on from them. And she was just saying that she was doing a study or something at the time, I think when she was at the Smithsonian. And she said, it used to be that people came into their worship space and they were beaten up, they were dragged down, they were devastated. And so those opening moments, they needed to sing something that spoke to that. They needed to resonate with each other in that pain and that suffering. As you sing, you begin to sort of transform from that moment, and then you're able to sort of move into a lighter song. And by the end of the service, which of course in their case went about 3 hours,
Yeah.
and in my church went 2.5, by the end of the service, you feel relieved. And now you feel like, oh, I can sing a celebration song, and everybody's up and they're going. She was just saying that, in the new sort of praise and worship settings, people come in, they want to go right to the happy right away. And she was just kind of pointing out that this isn't something that serves the human soul in her mind. And I had to agree with her. So I use that framework in the performances that I do, that I try to give people an experience, a place to let go of some things. And certainly, I see this happening online. I could certainly see it more often when you're in a room with people. And on a Friday night, people come in and they're just absolutely and totally dragged out from the week. And so I want to honor that and not ask them to do too much, but then slowly but surely the songs build. And then you can add in some other stories and add in a fabric of celebration. And then, of course, the ending would be the charge. It's like, we shall overcome. Or, just some song that really kind of, this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. So go forth and shine your light in the world. For me, it's healing just to do it. And I think that, in the early years when Kim and I were performing, we were always so worried about the fact, are people going to like us? And I think a lot of performers go through that. And then along the way, I began to realize that this music speaks to me in such a deep way. I do this because I love the music. I love to sing, and the music heals me. And the music informs me, and it gets me inspired. So I had a chance to talk to an airline pilot once. And he was taking me to the airport because it was a long story short, but anyway, he knew the quick way to get to the airport. So I was asking him all these questions about, aerodynamics and all this stuff. And, what happens when you hear the engines do this. And I asked him, I said, you're flying the plane and you have 200, 300, maybe 400 people behind you. Do you feel the pressure of having all those people there? And he said, no. And I said, come on. I mean, really, you got to be thinking about that all the time. He said, no, I really don't. I said, you're not. He said, no, I didn't say I don't care about the people. He said, but I look at it this way. I fly the plane because I like to fly and I want to live. So I fly it to the best of my ability. They can come along for the ride. And that opened a whole new realm of performance for me because I do care about the people who are in my audience and I care what they think about me in the abstract. But I'm on that stage because this music has spoken to me for decades. And I want to share it. I want to share the magic and the power and the joy and the celebration and the depths of sorrow that come from stories. And I want to share about, my life and my liver transplant and all the things that have happened in a context where if I'm universal enough, people can see their own story and they can resonate in their own. And I once had a guy come up to me at the end of a concert and he said, I loved your show. And thank you so much for that song about Vietnam vets. And I said, you're so welcome. Thanks for coming. And I thought to myself, I don't have a song about Vietnam vets. I have no idea what song he's talking about. But something spoke to him.
Yeah.
I don't have to know what it is.
Something was universal enough that it touched that for him. It was about that. Yeah. That's great. Well, you just mentioned your liver transplant, which I know was a life-changing experience too. How has that affected your hope and your songwriting?
Well, I think it's affected both in a way that just continues to grow. I actually found out that I had an illness because I went to give blood for one of Kim's aunts, and she had leukemia, and they need somebody to donate blood plasma, and I went to give blood and got a letter from the Red Cross saying that something was wrong with me, and this was about 1995 or 96, and I felt fine, but fortunately for me, going to give blood gave me a heads up. It would be 2 years before they discovered that I had this autoimmune illness. And then it was 13 years before my body finally was about to give out and my liver was dying. And in the 11th hour, lying in a hospital in Philadelphia, one of the surgeons came in and told me that they'd found a liver and that it was a perfect match. And the next day they put it in. The surgeon came into my room later and he said, it's a beautiful liver. It pinked right up. Medical talk.
Right.
But I woke up. Well, that whole journey was devastating. I mean, I was by the time of the 2008, I was 135 pounds. I was 3 shades of brown. I was gray. I was yellow. I was weak. I was breaking out. And I was ready to die. And I never believed I would. But they told Kim at the time that I had about a week and a half to live, and then the liver came. And all along the way, because of that suffering and because it was so hard, I was singing all the way, doing concerts right up until probably the last 2 months. And then I had time to really work through everything and to think. And when I woke up from that operation, I knew that I'd been granted a new life. And I made a promise to myself that I would talk about organ donation on every opportunity and to encourage people to go online and become donors. And then that I would live into that new reality. And one of the places that it really came as a vibrant new experience was the music. Because remarkably, I went into the hospital in September of 2008. And from September until about 2 weeks after I got the liver in October 28th, I didn't think about music. I didn't listen to any. My friends who came to visit would offer to sing, and I would say, I don't really, no.
Yeah.
There was just a whole space that I went inside, and music wasn't part of that. So when it came back alive, I was ready to embrace it with all the force that I had, and I hear things differently. And I let go a lot of that fear. And I think a lot of the residue from those years when people said I wasn't this, I wasn't that. I didn't go to conservatory. I wasn't, the purest singer. My songs don't do this. I just decided, I almost died. And now I have this opportunity to live. And I'm just not going to think about any of that stuff. And so at this point forward, the emotional impact of music on me and the emotional impact of doing it is just electric.
Mm-hmm. That's great. So, one last thing, you played in our concert series this year, and you've mentioned the song "Free at Last" several times. And one of the reasons that we asked you to play that particular song, which you've done before, is that we have an archival recording of it, of two women who were born in slavery, who lived through emancipation, and who sang the song for Alan Lomax in 1934. So just wondering, I know you had a chance to listen to that recording and read their story a little bit, and what did you think about it? How did that affect your own take on the song?
The thing that first came to me, first of all, the recording is just, again, those voices carry something that we don't have.
Yeah,
And that was the first thing that hit me. And then I thought about the through line to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. because, he grew up in Atlanta and he grew up in that community in the same way that I did, in a community that was really celebrating song. But that song had to find him. And those women singing it and passing it on, the fabric of those songs coming out of those people, and thank goodness for Alan Lomax and for all the work that he did to forward those recordings. But those songs lived in the community.
yeah,
People continued singing those songs. There was no break. People held on to them. The way I often say it is that those people, as C.T. Vivian said, we were living and working on something that was much bigger than ourselves. We understood that. So we knew that we only had a part to play, and that in playing that part, through the songs and through the stories, we would pass that information on to our children. We couldn't see where that would lead them, but we passed it on because we were faithful to the journey and to the mission. So it continued. That song continued through, the 30s and the 40s. And obviously, it connected with Dr. King somewhere in that fabric. And on that day when Mahalia Jackson said, "Martin, tell him about the dream," he knew to go get that song. That song was a fabric in how he built his dream. And hearing him say that passed that dream on to me, because that wasn't one of the songs we sang in my church. I didn't hear that song until, as a matter of fact, I heard the words out of his mouth. I still hadn't heard the song. Kim
right.
and I went and found a version of the song. And we didn't find the one you sent, which would have been great. But we found a version of the song because we wanted to end our Underground Railroad program with it, celebrating Dr. King's legacy. So the song took on a whole another posture for me. And when I heard the version that you turned me on to, hearing that song out of its beginning stages connected me across the years to the fabric of strength that those people, those women, had. And I thought immediately of all those sisters in my church growing up. I can still hear their voices in those feet on the floor as they would sing for hours in an afternoon, all those songs. So, it's a continuum that, as you get older, you begin to understand that it's something to pass on to the youth. It's something to give to them, so that this continues to grow, and they will take it and do what they will.
Well, Reggie, thank you so much for this interview. You're just such a great singer, musician, storyteller, and educator, and you've taught us so much in this conversation. And we're just really glad to have had you in the concert series in the first place, but also to have had you here for this separate interview.